Hi comrades, thank you so much for inviting me to speak here today. As a young disabled trade unionist and workplace rep, it's amazing to be amongst you all at the Disabled Workers Conference. My name is Rachel O'Brien and I am a Policy and Public Affairs Officer at Inclusion London. Inclusion London is a London-wide second-tier deaf and disabled people's organisation, although we also do quite a lot of national work, particularly in our policy and campaigns. We have been working seemingly endlessly during the pandemic to lobby the government and other bodies to protect the rights of disabled people during the pandemic and to try and remove the easements in the Coronavirus Act that endanger disabled people's rights to social care and education. One of the main areas we've been working on, alongside our colleagues in the trade union movement, has been the rights of disabled workers. It's been long documented that disabled people face discrimination in the workplace, in recruitment and in career progression. The pandemic has made these disparities between disabled workers and their non-disabled peers even more stark. Research from Citizens Advice has shown that between 27 and 37% of disabled people were facing redundancy during the pandemic, although shielding that raised to half. These numbers are horrifying and demonstrate that the desperately needed work must be done by trade unions, the government and employers in tackling the disability discrimination in the workplace. This approach must be multi-pronged and must address the barriers to getting into the workplace in the first case, as well as the enforcement of reasonable adjustments once disabled people are in the workplace. The pandemic has illustrated that reasonable adjustments that were once a pipe dream for disabled people, dismissed by employers as not possible or realistic, are in fact both possible and necessary. The move to remote working has greatly benefited many disabled workers and offered up the job market to many of those who would have been excluded from the traditional workplace. But it would be naive to think that working from home is a good solution for all, and it would be a mistake to think that this has not been another way for employers to discriminate against their disabled employees. Inclusion London has run a national survey asking disabled people about their experiences during the pandemic. And on the theme of work, their responses were very grim. We heard stories of disabled workers being forced to use statutory sick pay, annual leave and unpaid leave, rather than being furloughed or their job descriptions being slightly changed so they could do their jobs from home. We heard of disabled people that were working from home, but access to work took too long or was too inflexible to provide the support they needed in a new working environment, so they lost their jobs. We've heard stories of disabled workers at increased risk to coronavirus who cannot work from home being forced into work with the threat of redundancy. So they have had to choose between their livelihoods and their lives. This is, of course, too, all highly racialised and gendered. The case of Belly Majinga being just one tragic example of employers and the government's absolute failure to protect those most at risk of dying during the pandemic. Disabled people are also overrepresented in insecure work on 0 hours contracts in sectors known to be particularly hostile to workers' rights and lax on workplace safety. So whilst I am here to talk about reasonable adjustments, I'm also here to make the point that you can't truly effectively make reasonable adjustments within the system of work that the UK currently has. We can't just tinker around the edges. We need transformational change in how work works. This means an end to 0 hours contracts where work asking for a reasonable adjustment could just end up in a worker not getting any more hours. This means sick pay that someone can actually live on, so they don't have to go to work when they are not well. This means mandatory offers of furlough to all workers who are at increased risk of serious illness due to COVID, those that live with them, and people with other caring responsibilities. These are all things which go beyond the traditional purview of reasonable adjustments, but they are all things that must be tackled if we want reasonable adjustments to be at all effective and to be enforceable. So on to reasonable adjustments. It is a duty in the Equality Act that employers must provide their disabled employees with reasonable adjustments in order for them to be able to carry out their jobs on an equitable basis to their non-disabled peers. Some examples of reasonable adjustments could be something as small as providing materials on a different coloured paper, to bigger things like the rewriting of job descriptions to remove certain tasks that someone may not be able to do for impairment-related reasons, flexible working, so this includes both the hours and the location of work, are also reasonable adjustments. The concept of reasonable adjustments is a good one, if not one that is limited by the larger working conditions in the UK, as I mentioned before. The real issue comes down to the enforcement of reasonable adjustments. The Equality Act is ultimately completely toothless. It relies on individual disabled people who've been discriminated against taking a case against, in this instance, their employer. For most disabled workers, this is not possible due to the associated cost and risks this poses to them. For those that do take their employers to court, most of the time they will not be able to go back to their jobs, even if they receive financial compensation of some kind. There must be a national regulator and enforcement of reasonable adjustments that does not rely on individual disabled people taking legal action. Ideally, this would be through a body like the Equality and Human Rights Commission. However, the situation with the EHRC is not an ideal one, with it being explicitly admitted recently that Liz Truss is packing it with people of her own particular ideology. So whilst our long-term goals must involve public bodies, national equalities institutions and demands on the government, in the shorter term, trade union organising in workplaces has never been so important for the health, safety and equality of disabled workers. An injury to one is an injury to all in the workplace, and when our colleagues are being targeted based on their circumstances or identity, it is now more important than ever that we stand in solidarity with one another. This is a fundamental principle of our movement, but it's also a practical one. They may start with attacks on one group of workers, but it never just stops there. For the future, we need a government that puts the rights of workers and disabled people at the heart of what they do. A good start to this would be reforming the Equality Act so it is fit for use. But it must be made equally clear that any reforming of the Equality Act must not be used as an excuse to further oppress and marginalise our transgender comrades even further. Changes to the Equality Act must be made to benefit the most marginalised amongst us and ensure that the rights of all are enforceable. We need mandatory pay and employment gap reporting. The employment rate for disabled people in 2020 was 53.7%, a gap of 28% with non-disabled people. This gap massively increases when you look specifically at the employment rates of disabled women and disabled people of colour. But it's not enough to mind the gap. The gap must be acted upon. Inclusion London absolutely agrees with our colleagues in the TUC who back action plans to address pay and employment gaps, and we too agree that these plans must be made by the employer in partnership with a workplace trade union. I'm going to stop here because I'm aware I've just said a lot, but I think the important points to take from this are the need for strong workplace unions, the enforcement of reasonable adjustments with the monitoring and transparency to do this, and the need for government to introduce and strengthen legislation to improve workplace conditions for all. Thank you so much for inviting and listening to me this afternoon.